Welcome back to This is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about Commander Tough Rules and Cool Interactions, episode 163. Today's episode is going to take a look at one of the cards from the latest spoiler season for the upcoming Aether Drift set. The card is colorless, and it has both card advantage and mana ramp on it, so of course it's going to see a whole lot of play in all sorts of kind of decks, and because you're probably going to see it often and also use it often in some of your own decks, I figured I'd dedicate this video to it and just cover all sorts of neat little bits of information about it, and maybe this will give you a cool idea involving this card for your own decks. So let's start your engines, and yes, that's a joke specific to the Aether Drift set. Okay, moving on. The Aetherspark is a 4-mana legendary artifact Planeswalker equipment. That's a mouthful. It is the first of its kind. It enters with 4 loyalty and has 3 loyalty abilities, as well as a static ability that says, as long as the Aetherspark is attached to a creature, it can't be attacked, and has whenever equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on the Aetherspark. And as for loyalty abilities that it has a +1 to attach it to up to 1 target creature you control, and you then put a +1/+1 counter onto that creature. It has a -5 to draw 2 cards, and finally it has a -10 to add 10 mana of any one color to your mana pool. Now, before jumping into the neat tricks and such, I want to make sure that everyone is clear on the wording used here on the Aetherspark. The triggered ability that it gains when it is attached to a creature states that you get that many counters onto it when the equipped creature just deals combat damage during your turn. It doesn't specify combat damage to a player or to an opponent. So this means that even when your equipped creature is blocked, it's still dealing combat damage, and you will get those counters as long as it does deal that damage to the blocker. In case they prevent the damage or give it protection, sack the creature in response before damage, all that kind of stuff would stop it. This also applies to them attacking a Planeswalker and a battle. Those are still combat damage when you attack one of those Planeswalker or battles. But if your creature uses an activated or triggered ability during combat that ends up dealing damage, that isn't considered combat damage, despite it being damage that is being dealt during combat. We've seen similar wording to this on the 2 Jittes that we've had printed in the past, so it's very nice to have that it just cares about combat damage. So now let's jump into neat tricks that you can do with the Aetherspark, and also little things that you should probably want to know about it to be aware of. Starting with how a Planeswalker is actually able to be attached to a creature. It wasn't all too long ago that we got the reconfigure ability that allowed the existence of cards that were both a creature and an equipment, and reconfigure allowed for you to attach that to a creature, because as part of the reconfigure ability, it made the object lose its creature type. The rules don't state, however, that anything other than an equipment cannot be equipped to a creature. They just state that creatures cannot be equipped onto creatures. But their rules do not say that Planeswalkers cannot be equipped to creatures. Here's a fun bonus fact. If you have a creature that has protection from creatures, then you cannot reconfigure onto that creature as a still creature equipment. Because the reconfigure ability, when it's activated, it needs a legal target while it's on the stack, and the source of that ability is currently still a creature, and so it cannot target that protection from creatures creature. There is a loophole to this. If you just reconfigure it to a different creature that is a legal target, then the reconfigure ability will have resolved and removed the creature type from the permanent, and now you can activate the reconfigure again to attach it to the protection from creatures creature, and it will work just fine, as now the source is no longer a creature. So long story short, don't put the Luxior, Giada's Gift, onto your Aetherspark if you intend on attaching the Aetherspark to creatures you control. I have made 2 videos on this next part coming up in the past, and I'll link one of them down in the video's description below for you to check it out to get more details and proper CR citation. But as Planeswalkers enter the battlefield, they have a replacement effect that replaces how they enter differently than a permanent normally does, in that they enter with a number of loyalty counters equal to that number in the bottom right of their card. However, when you use their loyalty abilities that involve them gaining more loyalty, that increase that they get in loyalty isn't an effect or ability, it is actually the activation cost. It is the payment for that loyalty ability. And therefore, a card like Doubling Season that cares specifically about effects placing counters onto permanents you control, then the Doubling Season will not care about the cost that you've paid of adding counters to the Planeswalker. But it will increase the number they entered with, as again, that is a replacement effect. Very importantly though, if you control another card that has a replacement effect on it that does actually increase the number of loyalty counters they get from their uptick abilities, something like Peer or Vorinclex here that you see on screen, as they just care that the counters are being placed onto the permanents, and they don't care why. So then now your Doubling Season will actually double those counters placed onto them, assuming of course that that is how you choose the order for your replacement effects to apply. One other thing to note with Planeswalkers is that while their loyalty abilities are quote-unquote sorcery speed, they are still a little quote-unquote faster than instant speed removal spells. Okay, that's enough quote-unquoting for now. What I mean by this is that once your Planeswalker enters the battlefield, unless there is a triggered ability that did trigger from it entering, the stack will be empty and you will have priority, which means that you can activate your Planeswalker's abilities before anyone gets a chance to use an instant speed removal on it. In the case of the Aetherspark, it enters with only 4 loyalty, and the 2 downticks cannot normally be used, but if you do have a replacement effect, as discussed earlier, letting them enter with more, then no player can stop you from getting that chance to draw those 2 cards if you really just want to -5 then and there. Another interesting thing to note is the 3rd loyalty ability here. It adds 10 mana to your mana pool, but is that actually a mana ability that it has? If we take a look at the comprehensive rules and go to section 605.1a, we can see that an activated ability is a mana ability if it meets all of the following criteria. It doesn't require a target, it could add mana to a player's mana pool when it resolves, and it's not a loyalty ability. So that last part makes it pretty clear that the Aetherspark's ability isn't a mana ability. Even when equipped, it's still a Planeswalker, and it doesn't matter because even non-Planeswalkers can have loyalty abilities that are activated. So even if you somehow made it lose its Planeswalker status, it's still a loyalty ability. But what does that mean from a practical game-impacting perspective? Well, the biggest thing is that because it's not a mana ability, it actually uses the stack when you activate it. And why is that important that it uses the stack? Well, that means that it can be interacted with in ways other abilities can be. If you wanted to counter it and then stop them from getting the mana that they're producing from their ability on their Aetherspark, then you can. We can even see the reminder text here on this disallow. It tells us that we cannot counter mana abilities, but since this isn't a mana ability, we can now. If you wanted to copy that ability with something like Lithoform Engine, then you can do that to end up with 20 mana of one color. One final thing that I'll mention on this aspect is that you cannot use the 10 mana ability to pay for certain things to an extent in the game. Under normal circumstances, you couldn't use it to pay for an attack if an opponent controlled a propaganda and you had to pay for that propaganda attack. Mana pool's empty after each step and phase ends, and you can normally only activate loyalty abilities during your main phase, not as you're declaring attacks during the combat. So paying those costs in order to attack, not something that you're likely to do. If you have a way to make mana pools not empty and float that mana between steps and phases, then that will help you out. Cards like this Omnath here and also Horizon Stone are great for that. And speaking of Omnath, he's just a perfect commander to run this Aetherspark in because he can get really, really big and just keep growing and growing and growing as you continue to add more mana, which gives you more activations and so on and so forth. Okay, those are the sneaky things that I could think of, but I'm sure that there are all sorts of other things out there that I'm not thinking of. Are there any other tricky scenarios that I've not thought about? If so, please ask them down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Are you planning to be running this new Aetherspark in your deck or multiple decks that you have? Again, it's colorless card advantage and colorless mana ramp, so I imagine it can fit into a lot of decks. I don't personally normally run Planeswalkers in a lot of my decks, but I do have a Vorinclex Monstrous Raider deck, and the thought of me playing the Aetherspark and having it entering with 8 loyalty and then attaching it, using its attach ability, giving 2 +1/+1 counters to my Vorinclex, making him now an 8/8 Trampler, and then the Aetherspark already now at 10 loyalty because it got an increase in counters placed on it from the uptick, and then after combat it gets 16 more loyalty counters from the 8 damage that my Vorinclex did. That's a pretty wild result to have that 10 extra mana on my next turn just from a 4 mana investment. Some other decks that I could see wanting this Aetherspark, some other commanders that I could see wanting it, would be something like Kellen the Fey-Blooded. You can tutor this thing. The guy's got double strike. Really, really good. Felix 5 Boots is a really, really cool one. I'll actually probably clarify that one here in just a little bit. But also, in general, any other commanders that get really, really, really big, like Yargul and Multani and any other kind of ones that can get big. And so yes, do be careful if you put it in your Felix deck, as it will only get the double trigger from Felix if you hit a player with the equipped creature. I guess another little bonus bit, I'll go more into detail. If you controlled a Felix and you attack with a Trampler like this here Coma World Eater, that is an 8 power creature, and now that you've equipped with the thingy, it's probably a 9 power creature after you've attached the Aetherspark to it, because of the 1/1 counter that it gets, and then your opponent assigns an 8 toughness creature to block it. So you assign 8 of the damage to the blocker, and then 1 damage to the defending player. Clearly, the Coma's own triggered ability will trigger an additional time via the Felix, but what about the Aethersparks? In this case, yes, it will, but how many counters will be placed onto it in total? In the combat, the Coma did 8 damage to a creature and 1 damage to a player. So the initial trigger will result in 9 counters, but will the 1 additional trigger from Felix see all 9 of that? Or just the 1 that was actually dealt to a player, as that's the original trigger condition for Felix to make an additional trigger? Thankfully, all that matters is that it was triggered before, and the entire trigger will happen again, and the Felix additional one will see that it dealt 9 total damage. Doesn't matter if it was only 1 to the player, it'll get all those 9 counters added again. Okay, now I actually am out of stuff. Again, what decks will you guys be putting this into, and what tricky scenarios can you think of? What rules questions do you have for the Aetherspark, or really any of the newly spoiled cards that are coming out? I'm sure we'll see a lot more crazy ones, especially with a lot of car stuff things. It's weird, car stuff. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta!